saw you. I know what you did. That secret thing you thought no one would ever find out about. I know. I was watching.
Most people never seriously examine whether their mind is free. They assume the thoughts arising in their head belong to them. They assume their beliefs were chosen. They assume the identity they defend is something they consciously built. But you and I are the kind of people who have quietly wondered whether something deeper is running underneath those assumptions. That's why an awakening journey doesn't begin with that assumption. It begins the moment that assumption cracks. What if large parts of what you call you were conditioned into place long before you had any real choice? What if the mind you trust most is running programs you never installed? This is the real starting point. Not a mystical experience, not a sudden spiritual awakening, just the quiet recognition that something deeper needs to be examined. This isn't about becoming a better version of yourself. It's about seeing the machinery that's been shaping you. Most people hear the phrase and picture a spiritual awakening. Lights, downloads, a higher state of being. That's one possible interpretation. Some people experience the process that way. But the deeper process is more precise. It's the gradual recognition of the conditioning, the beliefs, the identity structures that's been determining your perception of reality. It's an inner awakening that doesn't add something new. It doesn't make you free. It makes you question whether you ever were. I want you to get this. It doesn't make you free. It makes you question whether you ever were. A true consciousness shift often begins with discomfort. You start noticing that many of your reactions are automatic. You start seeing that self-awareness is not the same as freedom. You begin to understand that personal transformation only becomes real once you can observe the programs that have been running underneath your choices. This is conscious living at its foundation. The willingness to look at what has been looking through your eyes this entire time. The journey is not an escape from the mind. It's the decision to finally study it. Once we decide to study the mind, the first thing we notice is how little of it was actually chosen. Much of what feels like you was installed. Early experiences, family patterns, cultural rules, repeated emotional response that becomes automatic. These form the hidden architecture. Conditioning creates beliefs. Beliefs harden into identity. Identity then filters perception. And perception decides what you're even capable of seeing. This is why personal transformation is so rare. People try to change their thoughts while leaving the structure that produces those thoughts completely untouched. Self-awareness helps, but awareness alone isn't enough. You can become very good at watching the programs and still remain inside them. Self-discovery in the deeper sense, it's not collecting more stories about who you are. It's the process of noticing which parts of that story were never examined. Mind is not neutral, it's protective. It will defend the existing structure even when that structure is causing suffering. This is the part almost no one is taught to look at. You're not simply having thoughts. Thoughts are having you until you learn to see the architecture that generates them. Did you hear that? You are not simply having thoughts. Thoughts are having you until you learn to see the architecture that generates them. Once you begin to see it clearly, a different question becomes unavoidable. If so much of the mind was conditioned into place, how free is it, really? Feeling free and being free are not the same thing. Most people use the feeling as proof. They can choose what to eat, what to watch, what opinions to express, and they take that as evidence that the mind is free. But choice inside a conditioned structure is not the same as freedom from that structure. You can select from the options that architecture already allows. That doesn't mean you can see beyond the architecture itself. This is the quiet distinction almost no one examines. Your preferences feel personal. Your reactions feel justified. Your beliefs feel earned. Yet if those preferences, reactions, and beliefs were shaped by conditioning you never reviewed, then what exactly is doing the choosing? Self-awareness can reveal the patterns. It doesn't automatically dissolve them. You can watch the same emotional response arise for years and still be governed by it. You can understand the origin of a belief and still defend it as if it were a conclusion you freely reached. This is where the question becomes sharper. Is the mind free, or is it simply sophisticated at protecting the illusion of freedom? Some people describe the moment they first see this clearly as a spiritual awakening. Others experience it as a psychological rupture. The label matters less than the recognition itself. Once you notice that many of your responses were instilled rather than chosen, a deeper problem appears. Who's the one noticing? If the observer is still operating from the same conditioned identity, then even the act of waking up can become another performance of the old structure. That's the edge of this section of the journey. Not the comforting idea that you're already free, the more precise and uncomfortable possibility that freedom begins only after you stop assuming you possess it. I want you to get this. Freedom begins only after you stop assuming you possess it. If freedom doesn't begin with the belief that you're already free, then what does the process actually require? Not another belief system, not a new identity to perform, not a collection of techniques designed to make the old structure feel more comfortable. It requires observation that doesn't immediately try to fix what it sees. Most people approach their inner world the same way they approach a problem. Diagnose it, improve it, replace it. That impulse itself often belongs to the conditioned mind. The awakening journey at this stage asks for something more exacting. You begin to watch the automatic responses without instantly rewriting them. You notice the belief arising without rushing to defend or discard it. You observe the identity protecting itself without turning that observation into a new story about how aware you are. This is harder than it sounds. The mind is skilled at turning even self-examination into another performance. It can turn the desire to wake up into a new form of seeking. It can turn insight into a subtle claim of superiority. Genuine progress here is quieter. It looks like sustained attention on the process of conditioning itself. It looks like the willingness to stay with discomfort instead of escaping into explanation. It looks like conscious living that is measured not by how elevated you feel, but by how clearly you can see the machinery while it's operating. The journey doesn't reward the person who collects the most insights. It rewards the person who stops using insight as a place to hide. That's the practical requirement. Not transcendence on demand, not permanent peace. The capacity to remain present with what is actually happening in the mind without immediately turning it into something else. Only from that position does the next threshold become visible. There is a threshold in this process that most people only recognize after they've crossed it. It's the moment the investigation turns back on the investigator. Up to this point, the mind can still treat everything as information. Conditioning, beliefs, identity, even the question of freedom. All of it can remain conceptual, something being examined from a safe distance. Then the distance collapses. You begin to see that the one who has been examining is itself part of the structure under examination. The observer is not outside the architecture. The observer is shaped by it. I want you to get this. The observer is not outside the architecture. The observer is shaped by it. This is the point of no return. Not because something dramatic happens, but because something irreversible does. Once you clearly notice that the lens through which you've been viewing reality is itself constructed, you cannot fully return to the previous innocence. You can ignore it, you can bury it, you can build new stories around it, but you cannot completely unsee it. This is where the old metaphor becomes useful. Not as a film reference, but as a precise description of the shift. There is no spoon. Not because the physical object disappears, because the assumption that your perception of the object is pure, direct, and free of conditioning is what dissolves. The spoon was never the point. The unquestioned belief that you were seeing it as it is, that's the point. The same applies to everything else. Your history, your identity, your sense of what is obvious and real. When that assumption cracks, the awakening journey changes character. It's no longer about improving the person you thought you were. It becomes the ongoing recognition that the person doing the improving was never as solid as it appeared. Some call this a spiritual awakening. Some call it ego death. Some simply experience it as a quiet, permanent loss of certainty. The label's secondary. What matters is the investigation no longer has a safe place to stand outside of itself. That's the threshold. Once crossed, the question is no longer only, is my mind free? It becomes something more exacting. What exactly has been looking this entire time? The awakening journey doesn't end with an answer. It ends with a different relationship to the question. Once you've seen that the mind you trusted is running more programs than you realized, once you've noticed that the observer itself is shaped by the same architecture, you cannot fully return to the previous certainty. You can only decide whether to keep looking. That decision is quieter than most people expect. No fireworks, no permanent state. Just the ongoing willingness to examine the assumptions that shape what you call reality. The mind will offer many ways to close the investigation. New beliefs, new identities, new explanations. The work is remaining open anyway. There is no spoon. And the one who sees that is no longer standing in quite the same place.